Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, good morning and welcome to this special event, which marks the formal observance at the United Nations of the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflicts, 19 June. It is an honor for Argentina to be hosting once again, together with the offices at the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflicts, Madame Pramila Patten, and for Children and Armed Conflict, Madame Virginia Bamba, a special event in commemoration of this International Day. We are gathered here today to raise awareness of the need to prevent, put an end and fight impunity for crimes of conflict-related sexual violence, foster solidarity with the survivors, and to pay tribute to all those who are courageously working on the front lines for the eradication of these crimes. As you recall, the International Day was established by the General Assembly in 2015 through its resolution 69/293, which was an initiative put forward by the government of Argentina. The theme for this year's observance is Prevention as Protection, enhancing structural and operational prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. We do believe that the best way to address any type of human rights violence, including sexual violence in conflict, is to prevent it from happening in the first place, which is why it is imperative to address gender inequality and the invisible drivers of sexual violence as root causes of this scourge. In that regard, we appreciate the latest report issues by the Secretary General, and we share the concern that inadequate attention has been paid to prevention in conflict at post-conflict setting. It is stated that, despite this gap, the roadmap for prevention is clear. Sustained focus is required on impact areas such as A, political and diplomatic engagement, B, the inclusion of sexual violence as prohibited act in the definition any monitoring frameworks of ceasefire agreements, C, the use of early warning indicators, D, gender-responsive justice and security sector reform, E, and amplifying the voices of survivors and affected communities. Regrettably, it is mentioned that only one of the ceasefire agreements reached between 2018 and 2020, the Juba Agreement for Peace in the Sudan, included a prohibition of sexual violence. Having said this example, we need to admit the existing great gap between the decision taken in the General Assembly and the Security Council and what is really happening on the ground. With regard to the protection of survivors of sexual violence in conflict, Argentina understands that it is essential to create mechanisms to protect, assist, and reintegrate all survivors of such violence in collaboration with women's organizations and other civil society members. In that sense, we highlight the importance of having women protection advisors in peacekeeping operations in order to improve coordination on the information available for the monitoring and prevention of sexual violence in conflict. Dear colleagues, sexual violence in conflict is a despicable phenomenon that not only affects international peace and security, it is a human rights as well as a gender issue, a scourge that affects every society and prevents its full and sustainable development. As the world continues recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to adopt an inclusive and intersectional approach while eradicating these crimes, one that recognizes that achieving durable peace and prosperous society is not possible without the expertise, mindful participation, and leadership of women in all their diversity. We hope that today's event will help us in reflecting about this issue. It is crucial we reaffirm our strong commitment to end the scourge and support survivors to rebuild their lives and pursue justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. SRSG Patton, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mrs. Maria del Carmen Squef, Permanent Representative of Argentina to the United Nations. Under Secretary General, Mrs. Virginia Gamba, distinguished guests and participants, both online and in person. A warm welcome to the 8th official commemoration of the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, and my deep appreciation to Argentina, whose leadership and vision were essential to establishing this day, which is now widely commemorated the world over. Indeed, every year since 2015, we have marked this occasion through expressions of solidarity with survivors and those working to support them on the front lines, often at great personal risk. Yet, as we survey the state of the world today, it is clear that we owe survivors more than solidarity. We owe them fast, effective, and decisive action to eradicate these crimes and prevent their recurrence once and for all. The question must therefore be asked, are we bringing all political and diplomatic tools to bear to narrow the gap between commitments made on the world stage and compliance by parties in theaters of conflict? Today's speakers will include the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Person, especially women and children, Mrs. Shoban Mullally, who will highlight the urgent challenge of preventing conflict-driven trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation, particularly the acute risk facing Ukrainian women and children, who comprise 90% of those forcibly displaced by this conflict. Mrs. Fauzia Kufi, the first woman deputy speaker of parliament in Afghanistan, a context where women are being progressively erased from public life and a crisis that risks being eclipsed under the long shadows cast by the horrors unfolding in Ukraine. And Assistant Secretary General of the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, Mrs. Gillian Triggs, whose perspective on protecting refugees and displaced persons from sexual violence is critical as the world contends with record numbers of civilians forced to flee their homes and homelands due to violence, persecution, and the highest level of conflict since the advent of the United Nations. I also wish to acknowledge our women protection advisors and colleagues in the field who have mobilized in connection with this International Day to amplify the message of prevention from the Central African Republic to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, and elsewhere. We are meeting at a time when conflict-related sexual violence is again in our daily headlines. New waves of conflict across the world have brought new waves of war's oldest, most silenced, and least condemned crime. Increased militarization and an epidemic of coup have turned back the clock on women's rights. Sexual violence as a tactic of war, terror, political repression, and reprisal undermines the ability of women to contribute to conflict prevention and recovery, limiting the prospects for inclusive and sustainable peace building and development. How we react to the first allegation of sexual violence in a conflict situation is the true test of our resolve. We cannot wait for statistics to scale up international support. There is never accurate bookkeeping on an active battlefield. In Ukraine, All the warning signs for the commission of atrocity crimes, including conflict-related sexual violence, are flashing red and have been so for over 100 days. The harrowing personal testimonies and pictures seen around the world, including of rape at gunpoint and rape in front of family members, are a call to action. While 124 cases of conflict-related sexual violence have been recorded to date by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Team, we know that for every victim who comes forward, many more are silenced by social pressures, insecurity, and the absence of services. While the United Nations system is verifying allegations of sexual violence, I would like to reiterate that we do not need hard data for a scaled-up humanitarian response. We do not need hard data for all parties to take precautions and preventive measures in line with international humanitarian law to spare civilian populations, their property, and essential infrastructure, including healthcare facilities, from attack, and to ensure zero tolerance for sexual violence. This is a historically hidden crime which we know is chronically underreported in times of war and peace. Accordingly, at the invitation of the Ukrainian authorities, I traveled to Lviv and Kyiv in May, which resulted in the signing of a framework of cooperation on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence with the government. This is in line with the operational methodology of my mandate, which recognizes that the United Nations can support, but can never supplant, the primary responsibility of states to protect their populations. I also visited two of the frontline refugee-receiving countries, Poland and Moldova, given concerns that this humanitarian crisis risks becoming a human trafficking crisis, including for the purposes of sexual exploitation and prostitution, as access to services and livelihoods become ever more precarious. As other crises continue to escalate behind the scenes in Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, Mali, Myanmar, and elsewhere, we must reassure populations at risk that they are not forgotten and that international law is not an empty promise. Tackling the root causes of this violence requires a sustained investment of resources and steadfast political resolve. It means evaluating our efforts not simply by demonstrating the absence of sexual violence, but by documenting the positive effects of prevention. This includes initiatives to reinforce individual and community-level resilience to withstand economic and security shocks. It means replenishing the relevant funding mechanisms, notably the conflict-related sexual violence multi-partner trust fund, which supports the operational arms of my mandate. For instance, my team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict works to strengthen institutional safeguards against impunity and to build the technical capacity of police, prosecutors, and the judiciary. The interagency coordination network that I chair, UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, brings together 21 UN entities for a multi-sectoral system-wide approach. The deployment of women's protection advisors has improved reporting as an evidence base for advocacy and action. Yet the fact remains, in no country is the level of human or financial resources equal to the scale of the challenge or commensurate with the level of humanitarian needs. Since 2008, significant progress has been made in enhancing global recognition of conflict-related sexual violence as a self-standing threat to collective security and an impediment to the restoration of peace. This shift in paradigm and perspective is reflected in a series of robust resolutions from 1820 in 2008 to 2467 in 2009, which require conflict-related sexual violence to be treated as a security issue that demands an operational security, justice, and service delivery response. It can no longer be sidelined as a second-class crime committed against second-class citizens. In one word, the promise expressed by the Security Council through these resolutions is prevention. Since I took office in 2017, I have consistently emphasized the need to address the root causes of sexual violence, in particular structural gender inequality, poverty, political exclusion, and marginalization. Equally, I have stressed the importance of working directly with survivors, not as passive beneficiaries, but as the co-creators of solutions. I have always been struck by the quality and far-sighted nature of their insights. The testimony of survivors that I have heard during field visits around the world contributed to the digital book that we launched last year, entitled, in their own words, Voices of Survivors of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence and Service Providers. It is evident that in addition to responding to sexual violence when it occurs, survivors expect its eradication altogether, as articulated by one survivor, so no other woman has to go through what I went through. Whereas military and political leaders have for centuries dismissed sexual violence as an inevitable byproduct of war, many survivors have affirmed that what happened to them could have been prevented. Survivors have made concrete recommendations which must be heard and heeded by the donor and diplomatic community. These include ensuring that commanders issue clear orders to prohibit all forms of sexual violence, avoiding troop deployments close to civilian population centers, safely locating water points and wells, and deploying patrols of police and trained peacekeepers to accompany women in the course of livelihood activities, among other measures. The most insidious effect of the myth that wartime rape is inevitable is that it implies prevention is impossible. As a Ukrainian woman civil society activist put it, we must do everything possible and everything impossible to end abuses and atrocities. This is an important reminder to not just do what is easy, but what is necessary and what is right. Over the past year, I have led a system-wide effort through the UN Action Network to develop a comprehensive prevention strategy which will draw upon these ground truths and the lived experience of survivors. The strategy responds to calls from governments and civil society organizations for a targeted prevention plan. It builds on our collective knowledge and experience, including our matrix of early warning indicators of conflict-related sexual violence, which we have been rolling out in peacekeeping and political missions across the globe since 2009. It complements the pre-deployment scenario-based training resources that have been developed to help peacekeepers identify conflict-related sexual violence and safely refer survivors to available services. This framework is intended to serve as a roadmap for more tailored, timely, and effective interventions as part of broader efforts to safeguard civilians from the effects of hostilities. I plan to widely disseminate and pilot the framework during the course of the year. For too long, we have been locked in reactive mode, only mobilizing to address these atrocities after patterns have been documented. Prevention measures, accountability measures, and protective legal frameworks are important signifiers of compliance with Security Council directives. Yet the measures prescribed remain inadequately implemented and enforced. What is needed now is not new standards of behavior, but better adherence to those that exist. We are not short on political commitments. We are short on concrete action, political courage, technical capacity, and financial resources. Closing the compliance gap requires a two-track approach to prevention as set out in our new prevention strategy. Firstly, all efforts must be brought to bear to prevent sexual violence from occurring in the first instance by mobilizing a broad range of stakeholders from the highest political levels to local action at the grassroots. Secondly, in cases when sexual violence does occur, Sustained support is needed to mitigate harm and prevent its secondary effects, such as re-traumatization, reprisals, stigma, and social ostracism. The first track, preventing the occurrence of sexual violence, entails tackling the root causes and drivers of these crimes. Sexual violence does not occur in a vacuum. It is tied to the resurgence of hostilities, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, mass population displacement, as well as harmful, deeply rooted patriarchal norms related to honor, shame, and victim blame. Prevention entails translating early warning signs into early response interventions. Gender-responsive security sector reform, including vetting, training, and civilian oversight. The inclusion of relevant provisions in ceasefire and peace agreements to prevent these crimes from being amnestied as the so-called price of peace. Leveraging the credible threat of sanctions, which can curtail the flow of arms and resources to perpetrators and spoilers to the peace. To incentivize corrective action and raise the cost of war's so-called cheapest weapon, and consistent, visible accountability measures as a form of deterrence, which signal to perpetrators that sexual violence will not go unpunished. Fostering prevention through compliance with international norms is key to breaking the vicious cycle of violence and impunity. No single entity can tackle these formidable challenges alone. Only partnership at the regional, national, and community levels can move the needle. My office has signed joint communique with the governments of a dozen affected countries, which include time-bound commitments to end sexual violence. Beyond traditional political partnerships, we are also engaging actors with moral authority, such as religious leaders. To this end, I'm pleased to announce that today I will be signing a framework of cooperation with Religions for Peace, a multi-faith movement that aims to foster peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, including by advancing gender equality. This framework outlines specific commitments to leverage the influence of religious leaders to change the behavior of parties to conflict, alleviate stigma, counter harmful social norms, ideologies, and attitudes, and ensure that faith-based communities provide a safe environment for healing and reintegration. The second track, prevention as part of the response to sexual violence, should be grounded in survivor-centered programming. The stigma of rape is debilitating, severing victims and their children from vital socioeconomic support networks, and exacerbating their vulnerability to exploitation. Key to mitigating these risks are multi-sectoral services, such as medical care, sexual and reproductive health services, including safe abortion care, psychosocial support, safe shelter, and protection, which is life-saving assistance that cannot be deprioritized in the face of competing demands. In this respect, adequate assistance is also a form of prevention in terms of reducing recourse to negative coping mechanisms, such as early and child marriage in the face of insecurity and economic desperation. Peace-building efforts must include effective avenues for redress and reparations, which is the justice intervention survivors request most, yet still receive least. Tragically, in the rare cases where reparations are disbursed, it is often years after the crime has occurred, when stigma, economic isolation, untreated injuries, and sexually transmitted disease have already destroyed the lives of victims and reverberated across generations. This includes to the children born of wartime rape who face specific threats and risks related to statelessness, poverty, exploitation, recruitment, radicalization, and abuse. Local women are often the first to raise the red flag about changes in the environment that may indicate or contribute to wider tensions and instability. It is vital to amplify the voices of affected communities to ensure that local realities guide the global search for solutions. In this respect, We must defend women's human rights defenders and protect the protectors. It is critical to safeguard civic space and the safety of victims and witnesses, as well as that of journalists who risk their lives to share these stories with the world. The central premise of our work, as outlined in the last annual report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, is the need to foster a protective environment that inhibits sexual violence in the first instance and enables safe reporting and response. Unpacking prevention entails the simultaneous reduction of risk factors and the promotion of protective factors. Yet, in many contexts, we are moving in the opposite direction and feeding the flames of conflict and violence through misogyny, militarization, impunity, and authoritarianism. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, every speaker who adds their voice to this debate is helping to end centuries of silence and denial, which have made rape war's ultimate secret weapon. Our purpose in putting these crimes on the public record is to give rape a history in order to deny it a future. United action in this area tells survivors their lives matter and tells perpetrators and potential perpetrators that the world is watching. It is time to move from the best intentions to best practice. The current context of emerging and entrenched conflicts makes it clear that no amount of protection is a substitute for peace. It is critical to enforce compliance with international norms, to forcefully denounce transgressions, and to mitigate the ever-rising risk of intimidation and reprisal against frontline actors and activists. We are here today in the shared belief that prevention is the best form of protection. In discharging my mandate, I'm guided by the conviction that the earlier and deeper we sow the seeds of prevention, the better and more sustainable their fruits will be. The problem of conflict-related sexual violence is too large and costly and has too many urgent consequences to wait for perfect answers. There is a compelling need for prevention now to rid the world of this scourge and to protect generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, SRSG Patton, for your clarion call to action for prevention. I'm glad to give the floor to Undersecretary General Virginia Gamba.
Thank you very much. Her Excellency, Señora María del Carmen Esquef, Permanent Representative of Argentina to the United Nations, Undersecretary General Patton, and Special Rapporteur on Trafficking, Professor Shoban Mulali. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege for me to mark the 2022 International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict with you, and to address how to better protect children, who are our most vulnerable but also most resilient from rape and other forms of sexual violence in the midst of a post-pandemic world. We have seen a worrying increase in incidents of sexual violence against children, including in the context of the pandemic, and our recovery efforts must give a central place to children and survivors of sexual violence, while also being closely linked to prevention efforts. Mandated by the General Assembly and requested by the Security Council, my office monitors and reports on grave violations against children in situations of armed conflict. Sexual violence against children is one of the 6 violations we monitor, along with recruitment and use, killing and maiming, abduction, attacks on schools and hospitals, and denial of humanitarian access. Through the monitoring and reporting mechanism, we verify cases of sexual violence, including rape. Since 2005, the United Nations has verified incidents of rape and other forms of sexual violence against at least 14,200 children. Nevertheless, the magnitude of verified incidents does not reflect the actual numbers, but is only the tip of the iceberg. Survivors, indeed, are often at risk of repercussions by perpetrators, stigmatization by societies, and faced with the lack of appropriate services, such as health and psychosocial support, as well as the lack of accountability mechanisms. This causes silence around the human rights abuses they endure. These are only some of the reasons that can explain underreporting of sexual violence, one of the most difficult grave violations to verify. Sexual violence is a pervasive tactic of war and terrorism, perpetrated against women, men, girls, and boys. It is used to displace communities as a form of political persecution, to terrorize and dehumanize, for ethnic cleansing, and to control female sexual and reproductive health and autonomy. Recent numbers on incidents of sexual violence against children are reflecting this devastating reality. Across the 21 country situations and one region covered in the 2020 Secretary General Annual Report on Children and Armed Conflict, 1,268 children were victims of sexual violence. This was an increase of 70% compared to the previous year. And even if the annual report covering the year 2021 has not been published yet, we already know that the number of children enduring sexual violence has continued to increase. Some countries present particularly staggering figures. For instance, in Somalia alone, over 700 cases of rape and other forms of sexual violence against children were verified between 2019 and 2021, with a lack of accountability. Girls are often used as rewards for fighters and an incentive for new recruits by Al-Shabaab. Girls that are forcibly married and become pregnant as a result of their abuse are often rejected by their families and communities and struggle to resume their education or socioeconomic activities. We have seen that in other contexts, such as in northern Uganda, years after the conflict ended, girls returning home with children born as a result of conflict-related rape suffered further victimization and rejection. This contributes to perpetuating the cycle of victimization of these girls and of children born of sexual violence in conflict. Since my mandate was created 25 years ago, evidence collected, including through the monitoring and reporting mechanism, points out that boys and girls are often face different and evolving risks across the conflict situations on the agenda. My office published last month a study on the gender dimensions of grave violations against children in armed conflict, which shed light on the gendered risks facing children in armed conflict. The study highlights the importance of better understanding the gender dimensions of child rights violations during armed conflict to inform our prevention and response strategies. The study showed that while the majority of survivors of conflict-related violence are girls, boys are frequently subjected to sexual violence in armed conflict and post-conflict situations, including as a form of ill treatment in detention settings. Even where services are available, survivors, both boys and girls, may be afraid to seek them out due to shame or fear of being rejected by their families and ostracized by their communities. The study further shows the importance of understanding patterns of sexual violence throughout the different stages of conflict to help understand how gender can be instrumentalized and how gender implications produce different and sometimes disproportionate impacts against girls and boys, so as to guide the design of prevention and response programs. Prevention efforts are particularly important to reduce or eliminate the risk of grave violations occurring against children in armed conflict, including sexual violence. As such, the Children and Armed Conflict Mandate can play a role in contributing to conflict prevention, acknowledging that serious abuses and violations of human rights or international humanitarian law can be also an early indication of a descent into or an escalation of conflict. We must not forget that mitigating the existence of violence against children in armed conflict is not enough. We must address the root causes of violence against children in conflict settings. And for that, we must increase our capacity to effectively predict, detect, and address spikes in grave violations against children and assess how this can be used as an early warning mechanism for conflict in general. Timely and accurate data is critical to inform early warning mechanisms, evidence-based advocacy and actions to prevent and address grave violations against children in armed conflict, including rape and other forms of sexual violence, and to inform the United Nations response. Accountability for grave violations against children in armed conflict, including broader transitional justice mechanisms, plays an important role in recognizing children's suffering and in overcoming stigmatization imposed by their own communities, especially for sexual violence. By taking action to facilitate children's access to justice, we're contributing to preventing conflict from occurring or reoccurring. For we must remember that preventing conflict, all conflict, remains the best protection for children from rape and other forms of sexual violence and all grave violations. Sustainable peace also requires that we consider the voices and needs of children in peace discussions. Incorporating the voices of conflict-affected children, including those victims of sexual violence, in mediation efforts, ceasefire, and peace agreements is essential in building peaceful societies which will enable a safe environment that prevents sexual violence while ensuring proper support and response mechanisms. In this regard, I encourage the use of the practical guidance for mediators to protect children in situations of armed conflict. I strongly hope that today's discussion will ignite crucial action to end and prevent sexual violence in conflict. All child survivors of conflict-related sexual violence must know that we stand in solidarity with them today and every day. In a post-pandemic world hit by scarcity of resources and protracted and new crises, it is more critical than ever to act to protect our children and ensure a safer and better future for them. This is our chance to make decisive changes for peace to last. I thank you.
Thank you so much, SRSG Gamba, for your painful but powerful statement that brings into this chamber the reality, the devastating reality of these crimes for children, and for your emphasis on early warning as integral to prevention. With that word, I'm pleased to introduce the second segment of our program and give the floor to Special Rapporteur on Trafficking, Madame Mulali. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Ambassador Maria del Carmen Squef, SRSG Patton, SRSG Gamba, co-panelists, excellencies and guests. Thank you for the opportunity to address trafficking in persons for the purposes of sexual exploitation today on this event to mark the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. We know that sexual violence in conflict includes trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation, and we know that conflict situations greatly increase the risks of trafficking. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by trafficking in persons for purposes of sexual exploitation. And trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation is often combined with other forms of exploitation in conflict situations: forced marriage, forced labour, domestic servitude, forced criminality. But as has been noted in the work of the Global Protection Cluster, trafficking in persons remains the single largest rights violation, exacerbated in times of crisis, in which the humanitarian community does not yet have a predictable, at-scale way to respond. These risks of exploitation occurring in times of crisis are not new, of course. They are linked to and stem from existing structural inequalities, gender-based discrimination and violence, and poverty. And such structural inequalities are exacerbated in the periods before, during, and after conflicts, and disproportionately affect women and the girl child. These inequalities have been further exacerbated against the background of the COVID-19 pandemic, where for the first time we have seen increases in child labour, concerns about potential increases in child marriage, and online child sexual exploitation against the background of closure of schools. In times of conflict, including climate-related conflict, displacement, loss of livelihoods, and breakdown of the rule of law and political, economic, and social structures, combined with increased militarism, all of these create situations in which trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation, including sexual slavery and forced marriage, increases. However, despite the reports of such incidents, documenting of such incidents in the reports of the Secretary-General, in reports of accountability mechanisms, such as the investigative and fact-finding mechanisms of the Human Rights Council, there is little follow-up in terms of investigation and prosecution of the crime of trafficking in conflict situations. This means that the systemic nature of this sexual violence and its role in continuing to fuel conflict and instability, in terrorising communities and in hindering the flourishing and protection of children, goes unaddressed. Failures of prevention and protection, including the lack of access to safe and legal migration routes, the lack of or restrictions on resettlement programs, limited access to family reunification and humanitarian visas, all foster conditions in which trafficking flourishes with impunity, including after hostilities have ceased. Children who are displaced, unaccompanied, or separated from families and caregivers may be particularly at risk and are frequently targeted by armed groups, including UN-designated terrorist groups. In conflict situations, the means used to recruit or transfer victims is often through abduction, frequently targeting schools or IDP or refugee settlements. Victims may be held for a few days, for weeks, or for much longer for purposes of sexual exploitation. Some survivors of abduction have been arbitrarily detained with their children. Others remain in displacement sites, for example, in Iraq and Syria, at serious risk of trafficking and re-trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation, forced marriage, forced labour, and forced criminality. Survivors and children born of rape also face indefinite stays in IDP camps in refugee settlements, unable to return to their communities or countries of origin owing to insecurity, discriminatory birth registration laws that prevent children from obtaining citizenship, and their alleged association with armed groups. Children born of sexual violence in conflict settings are often the children of victims of trafficking and continue to be at risk of statelessness, which in themselves render them at risk of human trafficking and recruitment by terrorist groups and other armed groups. Ending statelessness is a critical step towards prevention of trafficking, particularly of children, in conflict and post-conflict situations. We have seen increasing recognition from the Security Council of the link between activities of armed groups, including designated terrorist groups, and trafficking, particularly targeting children. Yet despite this recognition, accountability for conflict-related trafficking by members of armed and terrorist groups remains low. The African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child has repeatedly called upon states to prioritise the reintegration and rehabilitation of children who are victims of trafficking. Child trafficking is closely linked to the 6 grave violations affecting children in situations of armed conflict. In such situations, the recruitment and use of children nearly always constitutes trafficking, in light of the presence of the 2 required elements, namely the action, recruitment or abduction, and the purpose, exploitation. However, as I have highlighted in reports to the Human Rights Council and to the UN General Assembly in 2021, child victims of trafficking in conflict situations rarely receive the assistance and protection that is their right as children under international law. Security Council Resolution 2467 highlights the potential impact also of sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict situations on men and boys. However, the perpetuation of gender stereotypes in anti-trafficking responses, in prevention and protection, continues to hinder the timely and correct identification of victims and reinforces the invisibility of certain categories of trafficked persons, including men and boys, who may face additional difficulties in disclosing experiences of sexual exploitation. Similar difficulties may be faced by LGBT persons, given the context of discrimination and violence, which often leads to gaps in identification and assistance and protection. Increasing risks also of trafficking and re-trafficking. Without early identification of victims of trafficking and referral for assistance and protection, victims remain without support. The risks then of re-trafficking and of continuing exploitation persist. Currently, states are not meeting their obligations to ensure that specialised services, including medical assistance, sexual and reproductive health services, and counselling and reintegration measures are provided in conflict settings. The likelihood of recovery is therefore limited. In peacekeeping transitions, we need greater attention to prevent trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation, which may become a core activity of armed groups, contributing to continued instability and conflict and hindering processes of peace building and transition to peace and security. Transitional processes of security sector reform and justice sector reform need to integrate anti-trafficking actions if the objectives of peace and security are to be met. Collective action and coordination is critical because trafficking exists before, during, and after the conflict, and is fueled by factors that require long-term systemic change and also generates short, medium, and long-term support needs for victims. We have seen what can be achieved through coordinated action and a political will to prevent trafficking in conflict situations. The activation of the Temporary Protective Direction by the European Union, and similarly the granting of temporary protection status to more than 2 million Venezuelans displaced in Colombia, are examples of important measures that may help to reduce vulnerability to trafficking. The Ukraine Protection Cluster, including the child protection and gender-based violence areas of responsibility, and their partner organisations are increasing anti-trafficking prevention and preparedness activities. A time-bound anti-trafficking task force is now active under the Ukraine Protection Cluster with the aim of integrating anti-trafficking action in the overall protection response. The task force on unaccompanied and separated children, established under the Child Protection Area of Responsibility, is supporting efforts to prevent family separation and to provide adequate care to unaccompanied children as a key preventive measure to protect children from trafficking. We continue to see Ukrainian civil society and state actors prioritising action to prevent trafficking. In other conflict situations, we are not seeing the same coordinated response or the same political will, however, to reduce risks of trafficking. As the recent report from the Norwegian Refugee Council highlights, the world's 10 most neglected crises currently are all in Africa. Globally, the numbers of forcibly displaced people has passed more than 100 million for the first time. Many of those persons are displaced due to conflict, and we need urgent action to ensure that displaced persons, especially women and children, do not become victims of trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation. We need to ensure that action to combat trafficking in persons is integrated into women, peace and security agendas and protection and humanitarian actions and responses in all conflict situations. Explicit and targeted attention is needed to trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation if prevention and protection measures are to be effective. Such programs must be survivor-centred and survivor-led if we are to move beyond the limiting stereotypes of survivors as abject victims. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you so much, Special Rapporteur, for your statement and focus on the trafficking dimension. I'm pleased to introduce by video link Ms. Fauzia Kofi, the first woman Deputy Speaker of the Parliament in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Madam SRSG Patel. Ambassador of Argentina, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for commemorating the 8th official commemoration of and realization of the vulnerability of women and children in conflict situation. And special thanks and appreciations for including Afghanistan in this important debate. As we know, with the growing conflict in another part of the world, in this case in Ukraine, Afghanistan has been either less prioritized or erased from the international debates and conversations. Absolutely, women and children are the main victim of conflict, not only for losing their lives, but for losing opportunities and for being the victim of sexual exploitation and use by warring parties. The warring parties, in many occasions, even do not respect the culture of war. And this is especially true in the case of Afghanistan. The people of Afghanistan have been through more than 4 decades of war that they did not want, they did not initiate. For us, peace is not just silencing the gun. For the people of Afghanistan, peace is beyond silencing the gun. Peace is about inclusion. Peace is about respect. Peace is about rule of law. Peace is about culture of accountability and ending the culture of impunity. For very long, we have strived to achieve a peaceful situation settlement for Afghans, to witness a government that is representative of all its diversities in Afghanistan. However, unfortunately, we all know that after 15th of August, things escalated in a way that was not the wish of the people of Afghanistan, certainly not the wish of its women and children. We have hope that we will be owning a country that is inclusive enough, that is respectful of its citizens and representative of a transformed Afghanistan. But we know that for the women of Afghanistan and for the children of Afghanistan, it's getting day by day difficult for their lives. They are being literally erased from the public life. There is no accountability whatsoever for what happened to them. Not only that, women and girls are being deprived of their basic rights to education, to work, to access public services, but their rights to access law and be protected under the law. In fact, the latest decree of the Taliban that says women must wear their faces, cover their faces with a hijab, which is not even Islamic. And if they do not do so, the male member of the family has all the rights to stop the woman, gave the abusers of the woman, the violators of the woman's rights, an upper hand to control the woman's life. And that paves the way for further violence against women, for even increase in cases of honor killings. There has been no protection whatsoever for those women who actually are at risk of being exploited and sexually assaulted. For Afghan women, life under Taliban these days have become basically living in an open prison. The children, especially girl children who are beyond grade 6, 12 years of old, are being shattered. Their hopes are being shattered by not going to school. It's not about their education. It is about their education, but it's beyond that. It's about their role in the future economic, social prosperity of our country. It's about the fact that if a woman is not educated, she is not able to bring an educated son or daughter into the society. We will have the vicious circle of more guns and weapons in the future. And that's why, as you rightly said, Madam SRSG, if we do not really bring those beautiful words into action, we are going to face discrimination not only in the marginalized part of Afghanistan, like of the world, like Afghanistan or Ukraine or Syria or Yemen, but it will come to our own borders. And that's why I think it's our moral responsibility to stand in solidarity with those who are facing extremely dangerous situation in conflict, but also in silent conflict. And that's why my proposal and request today, this distinguished members today, is to take few measures to bring our beautiful words two good practices. The first, in the case of Afghanistan, the women of Afghanistan have had difficulty leaving their homes, let alone traveling abroad, for those who are facing enormous security challenges. However, we know that Taliban have been enjoying private jets traveling to different capitals, including to European capitals. The sanctions, the travel ban on Taliban have been lifted for them to meaningfully participate in peace process. We know that they have misused that sanction lift, and they have used it to boost their political position. Very soon, the UN Security Council will debate on this. My request is to bring back the sanction and the travel ban on Taliban's travel, not only for the selected names, but for all those who have been lately also involved in eliminating any kind of freedom for women and basically making women invisible. The second request I have for those who are engaged in Human Rights Council, we request you to have a statement in support of women of Afghanistan, because I know that the Taliban are cautious about international engagement. I know that they are desperate for recognition. That has to come with an accountability. The public platform we enjoy must come with an accountability, but must come with a response and with an attitude that make ourselves accountable to our nation. The people of Afghanistan expect stronger action. I know that you are all probably very fed up with hearing from Afghanistan, but let's not forget what happens in Afghanistan can impact your own borders if we do not act collectively in the face of discrimination, injustice, violence. Thank you.
Ms. Kofi, thank you so much for your timely and critical reminder of the plight of women and children in Afghanistan in particular, and your challenge to us all to bring words to practice. I'm happy also by video link to introduce and give the floor to United Nations Assistant Secretary General in the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Ms. Gillian Triggs, who will give some remarks on behalf of the UN Action Network. Ms. Triggs, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to recognize Your Excellency, Ms. Maria del Carmen Squiff, the Permanent Representative of Argentina to the United Nations, Under Secretary General Virginia Gamba, and Special Representative of the Secretary General, Pramila Patten, my fellow panelists, and ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Geneva. Thank you very much for including the United Nations Refugee Agency in marking this important day, the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. And as you will all know, UNHCR's mandate is to protect people forcibly displaced, usually by conflict. And the nature of our work with over 500 field officers and operations has meant that we are sadly witness to the sexual violence that each of the speakers has referred to so eloquently. As has been noted, the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, has announced that we have today over 100 million people forcibly displaced, either within their own country or across national boundaries seeking protection, most of them by conflict. And perhaps, again, to put things in context, this year, or in 2021 rather, we had 42 new conflict emergencies to which our colleagues in the UN Refugee Agency have been responding on the ground. The acts of sexual violence reported in the war and war contexts are reminders of the crimes in the context of Ukraine. Some of you have referred to this. Over 90% of those who have fled in Ukraine are women and children. And as Pramila Patten has pointed out, we do have some reported cases, over 120 cases reported through various agencies of sexual violence in this conflict, in this war. But we don't have accurate figures. It's seriously underreported. But we do know that from experience that where you have such vast movements of peoples, more than 7 million across the borders from Ukraine seeking protection, that they are extremely vulnerable, particularly to trafficking, but also they will have been vulnerable to sexual violence in the war from which they have fled. The Secretary General, in his annual report on conflict-related sexual violence, has noted that it is a tactic of war with devastating consequences. And sadly, those who've been forcibly displaced are disproportionately affected by sexual violence. And it's for this reason that the leadership of women must be promoted in relation to all the policies and responses that are made on their behalf. In particular, early programs against conflict-related sexual violence are life-saving and a top institutional priority for the UN Refugee Agency from the beginning of emergencies. We have recently adopted strategic directions that make gender-based violence one of the 8 core areas to be prioritized within the agency, and to a significant degree, that violence, as I've said, occurs in the context of the conflict-related emergencies to which we're responding. The aim is to support practical and concrete implementation of our GBV policy that was adopted 2 years ago as a cornerstone of our work to prevent, mitigate, and respond to all forms of gender-based violence. The UN Refugee Agency greatly appreciates the leadership of Special Representative Patton in the fight against conflict-related sexual violence, and particularly for her advocacy for a survivor-centered approach to prevention and to responses. Today's recognition of the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict allows us to repeat the call to perpetrators of war and violence to stop these brutal and senseless acts. And as many of you have observed, without peace, sexual violence will continue. But let me turn to another and more positive milestone, and that is the launch of the framework for the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. And this initiative could not have come at a more appropriate time. It's true that the world is really quite used to seeing the United Nations respond to conflicts or natural disasters. These responses receive quite a deal of media and public attention, but they are sadly prioritized over prevention activities. But the reality is that we need to ensure sexual violence in conflict is prevented from happening and that perpetrators are held to account, as each of you in different ways has stated. There is a very significant gap in investment between prevention and responses. And we suggest that prevention should be given a priority. And we're particularly encouraged that the new prevention framework will help in asserting and giving effect to that priority. We congratulate Special Representative Patton for her initiative aimed at strengthening the efforts in a whole of UN and whole of society approach. Our member states, UN entities and agencies, civil society, the private sector, parliamentarians, local mayors and governors, and practitioners to work in preventing sexual violence in conflict. I would also like to congratulate the UN Action Network for its dedicated work and technical expertise. A whole of UN approach is critical, and as many of you have mentioned, we can only respond to this scourge of sexual violence in conflict if we work together. It is possible. And I very much like the point that it is not a necessary feature of war, but something that we can work towards preventing more effectively. UNHCR has also contributed to the UN action by leading the core group on prevention. With 70 years of experience in the protection of refugees and people internally displaced, we do hope to share our experiences of good practice to prevent the rising nature of conflict-related sexual violence. So I look forward to the next phase of the prevention work and to the implementation of the framework on this whole of UN and whole of society approach. It's a concrete and much needed initiative in the fight against conflict-related violence. So yes, it is possible to end conflict-related sexual violence, and we very much look forward to seeing progress in future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary General Triggs, for your words and for the remarkable work of UNHCR on the front lines of conflicts the world over. I'm pleased to introduce the third and final segment, which will be interventions from regional groups and member states. I've been reminded that we are on a tight timeline in terms of our access in this room. So I would ask speakers to limit their statements to 3 minutes. And on the speakers list, we have, to begin, Your Excellency, Ambassador of Ireland. The floor is yours, Madam.
Thank you very much indeed. And I want to say a big thank you to the organisers for bringing us together today, and a special thank you to my European Union colleague who has kindly ceded the floor to me. And I, of course, align myself with the comments he will make next. I'm really deeply moved, I have to say, and impressed by the remarks we've already heard in the room. They will resonate with us for a long time. I sincerely wish it wasn't the case. I'll be frank, needing a day like today is a stark reminder of the mountain that we still have to climb on a crime that we shouldn't even have to countenance, but it's a crime that's in proliferation mode, as we've just heard from each speaker, seriatim on the podium, sexual violence in conflict. However, that's of course why, all the more reason why we need to take opportunities like this, which serve as a reminder that the international community, and that's us, must act united in our conviction that we have to eradicate sexual violence and conflict. And importantly, I think we heard this from several speakers, that we can actually work together on this and work to eliminate violence and conflict, sexual related conflict violence once and for all. While we've been on the Security Council for the last 18 months more, Ireland has made the Women, Peace and Security agenda and addressing conflict-related sexual violence a top priority. We don't shy away from calling out situations where CRSV is a serious concern: Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Myanmar, now Ukraine. It's fundamental that we don't allow these crimes to be hidden in the shadows. And I pick up on what Fauzia said just at the end in her remarks. We need to keep all of these situations in perspective. As co-chairs of the Informal Expert Group on Women, Peace and Security, Ireland has offered a platform to develop a deeper understanding of the complexities of CRSV across geographic files. We're working with our very able Mexican colleagues on that. Last year, we hosted a special session with women protection advisors from UN missions right around the world to give insight to the realities on the ground. And that it was also the first time that Pramila Patton, the SRSG, addressed the expert group at the Council. And that's something that we really hope, when we're no longer on the Council, will become a fixture in the Security Council's calendar. Now, I know that time is limited, so in closing these brief remarks, I just wanted to ask everyone in the room here today that we seriously reflect. We need to reflect on what we can do to end sexual violence, but as Pramila Patton put it earlier, to do not just what's easy, but to do what's necessary and to do what's right. She also said that it's time that we move from best intentions to best practice, and I think that that's what we really need to set ourselves as a minimum baseline. For our part, we know that that means, importantly, ensuring robust monitoring. It means ensuring that we have reporting mechanisms, fit for purpose reporting mechanisms in place, and critically that these are adequately funded across the UN system to ensure prevention. We heard, of course, that dedicated women protection advisors play an important role in this. We need to ensure we have them and that they're in the right places. We also need to ensure protection measures are in place and that there are widely available gender-sensitive, age-appropriate services that are survivor-centred. We heard that from Virginia as well. So just finally, we shouldn't be afraid to speak out against these crimes. Sometimes there's a hesitation. We should be ready to ensure that there's accountability and to put an end to impunity for crimes of conflict related sexual violence. What we really need to do now, we know what we should do, we just need to get on with the job. And I'll end, I'm afraid, by quoting Pramila again. CRSV can no longer be classified as a second-class crime perpetrated against second-class citizens. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador Nason, for your personal commitment and leadership. I'm pleased to give the floor to Ambassador Silvio Gonzato, Deputy Head of the EU Delegation.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The candidate countries Turkey and Albania, the country of the Stabilization and Association process, and potential candidate Bosnia-Herzegovina, as well as Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, and Georgia, align themselves with this statement. Mr. Chair, our appreciation goes to the special representatives of the Secretary General, to Argentina, and to all the briefers for today's important meeting. Excellencies, it's been 667 days since the military coup in Mali, nearly 600 days since the start of the crisis in Tigray, 500 days since the coup in Myanmar, 305 days since the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, and 117 days since the illegal Russian aggression of Ukraine. As new crises escalate, entrenched wars march on, including in the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, or Yemen. The fact is that we are facing the highest number of violent conflicts since 1945, with the return of invasions, military coups, and rising impunity. Women and those in vulnerable situations are bearing the brunt of instability. Sexual and gender-based violence is on the rise, used as a method of warfare, terror, and torture. Reports of sexual violence committed by Russian forces in Ukraine are horrifying, and we support the efforts of the SRSG pattern to assist survivors and ensure accountability. As underlined by the EU Gender and Diversity Ambassador Stella Rohner at the Security Council 2 days ago, we need less words and more action. Let me outline 4 priorities. First, we must address the underlying root causes of sexual violence. It is time all members of this organization take a clear stance against discrimination on any ground, including based on sex, race, color, ethnic or social origin, language, religion or belief, political or other opinion, belonging to a minority, property, birth, disability, age, sexual orientation, and gender identity. These discriminations fuel violence and exclusion, and we must fight them collectively. Second, impunity must stop. Prosecution and accountability are key to ensuring long-lasting peace. As recognized by the Security Council, it is urgent to strengthen legal procedures at national, regional, and international levels, notably through the Rome Statute and the ICC. Concerning UN sanctions, we reiterate our support for the Security Council to incorporate and apply sexual and gender-based violence as a designation criterion in UN sanction regimes in a systematic manner. Third, civil society must remain at the center of all efforts. We deplore that women peacebuilders, mediators, journalists, politicians, humanitarian workers, civil society leaders, and human rights defenders face increasing and specific challenges, including threats to their safety and freedom, which often hamper their ability to act. It is our collective responsibility to call out these threats when they happen, including in this building, and hold perpetrators to accountable and defend civic space. Fourth, a survivor-centered approach must guide our actions, with a focus on ensuring accessible and quality multi-sectoral assistance, including access to psychological and legal services, as well as to sexual and reproductive health and rights, in line with the program of action of the ICPD and the Beijing Platform for Action, and the outcomes of their reviews. Mr. Chair, Excellencies, the EU, as part of the call to action, is advocating and promoting the combat against all forms of sexual and gender-based violence as a priority in humanitarian contexts. And the European Union and its member states stand united in our unwavering commitment to support survivors and end impunity for the perpetrators. We will continue to actively use all our tools to that effect. I thank you.
Thank you. I'm pleased to give the floor to the Chargé d'Affaires of Switzerland, Ambassador Howry.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, I would like to thank Argentina as well as the offices of the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Sexual Violence in Conflict and for Children in Armed Conflict for organizing this important event, and all the speakers for their contributions. Last week, you, Undersecretary General Patton, asked so pertinently in the Security Council what the resolutions on women, peace and security, particularly the 5 focusing on preventing and addressing conflict-related sexual violence, mean right now for women in Ukraine. In the same vein, we must ask what the focus on prevention of both the WPS and the CAC agenda means for women in Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, Myanmar, Syria, or the children in Somalia, Mali, and South Sudan. These are some of the additional contexts in which we fall desperately short of fulfilling the goal of preventing these horrendous crimes. I would like to share 3 reflections on where we must do better to improve prevention, and we agree with the speakers that this is both possible and urgent. First, preventing conflict-related sexual violence starts with guaranteeing women's participation, autonomy, and rights, and achieving gender equality. As it has been underlined earlier today, we must create an environment that inhibits sexual violence in the first place and allows for safe reporting and response, and keeping in mind that men and boys, as well as non-binary persons, can also be victims and survivors. In addition, early warning indicators of sexual violence should be integrated into risk assessments from the outset of any crisis and maintained throughout the conflict cycle. Women's protection advisors and experts working for the UN monitoring and reporting mechanisms for grave violations against children can contribute to this goal, as the permanent representative of Ireland just pointed out. Second, in many conflicts, civil society and women human rights defenders are at the forefront of preventing sexual violence and working with survivors. Member states have an obligation to ensure that they can work in a safe environment. Switzerland partners with civil society actors, including community solidarity networks in many contexts. We call for their protection and encourage donors to provide flexible and long-term funding. Switzerland also contributes to the UN action against sexual violence in conflict through the CRSV Multi-Partner Trust Fund. And third, ending the prevailing impunity is key to prevention. Switzerland supports the efforts of the International Criminal Court to investigate and prosecute these crimes while developing gender-sensitive approaches. The rights and needs of survivors, including their sexual and reproductive health and rights, must be at the center of the fight against impunity at each step. We also welcome the increased use of designation criteria in sanctions regimes that focus on sexual violence, as well as the work of the team of experts on the rule of law. Chair, Excellencies, 14 years after the adoption of Resolution 1820 and 23 years after the adoption of Resolution 1261, we need political will, enhanced coordination, and sustainable funding to make the normative framework meaningful for women, men, and children everywhere. As a future member of the Security Council, Switzerland is committed to do its part that this issue receives the necessary attention, and I thank you.
Thank you so much, Excellency. I'm pleased to give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative of Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We thank Argentina, the Special Representative, Ms. Pramila Patton, and the Special Representative, Ms. Virginia Gamba, for convening this important meeting to commemorate the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. Mexico unequivocally condemns all forms of sexual and gender-based violence in conflict that may constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. As current member of the Security Council and co-chair of the Informal Expert Group on Women, Peace and Security, alongside Ireland, Mexico is sparing no effort to enhance the full implementation of the WPS agenda. Particular attention is paid to CRSV in country-specific situations to strengthen general gender analysis in the deliberations of the Council. Furthermore, we held a special meeting last year on sexual violence in conflict with the participation of women protection advisors deployed in different missions, and specific recommendations of practical nature emerged. We will have another meeting this year to give continuity to these actions. The latest Secretary General report gives an account of the complex and devastating scenarios in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Ethiopia, in Afghanistan, in Myanmar, in Sudan, in Syria, and Yemen, just to mention some places in which sexual violence in conflict continues to occur with unprecedented frequency as a weapon of war. More recently, we have heard numerous reports too indicating that sexual violence committed against Ukrainian women is on the rise. This is all unacceptable. In most cases, despite the comprehensive normative framework that we have built over the last decades, impunity remains the norm and survivors' access to justice the exception. The perpetrators are often recurrent, and yet they enjoy complete impunity. While the victims and survivors remain marginalized, besieged by absurd questioning, tedious procedures in local criminal justice systems that are neither designed to serve them nor to understand them. In this regard, we welcome the new framework for the prevention of CRSV with a comprehensive approach. And we are convinced, Mr. President, that all actions must be based on a human rights, gender-responsive, and survivor-centered approach. And it is particularly important to further, number one, ensure access to justice and strengthen accountability mechanisms. Two, involve the participation of survivors in policy making to respond to their priorities, needs, including sexual and reproductive health and rights services, as well as mental health and psychosocial support. Three, amplify the voices of women, peace builders, and human rights defenders in the prevention and attention of sexual violence. And four, respond to the needs of men and boys, as well as LGBTIQ plus victims of sexual violence. And finally, take to the International Criminal Court those cases that national authorities are unable or unwilling to prosecute. In this Observance Day, let's renew our collective commitment to eliminate sexual violence once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm pleased to give the floor to the distinguished colleague of the United Kingdom.
Chair. Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank our hosts for organising this critical discussion, and moreover, thank all those fighting to eliminate sexual violence in conflict, including those speaking today. The United Kingdom continues to stand in firm solidarity with survivors of these crimes. Sadly, every day reminds us that when conflict erupts, sexual violence follows. In Ukraine, northern Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and Myanmar, and elsewhere, the devastating effects of sexual violence on survivors and their communities are clear. As we have heard here, preventing this violence requires more than solidarity. It requires a range of actions. Delivering justice and accountability for survivors is one of them. Impunity cannot continue to be the norm. As a first step, we must ensure that survivors can safely record their experiences. That is why the UK was proud to launch the Murad Code during our presidency of the Security Council in April, which sets out how to document the experiences of survivors safely and effectively while ensuring they are not re-traumatized. The CRSV open debate in our presidency focused on strengthening accountability as a means of prevention. Accountability mechanisms can serve as a strong deterrent to future violence. It is important that when we make the promise of non-repetition to survivors, we act on that promise. Last November, we launched a call to action to ensure the rights and well-being of children born of sexual violence in conflict, which was endorsed by the SRSGs on children in armed conflict, sexual violence in conflict, and violence against children. This is a move to galvanize international action to enhance the rights and well-being for this vulnerable group and ensure they are given space to meaningfully engage in discussions and decision-making. The UK continues to increase its ambition to strengthen international action on this issue. With this in mind, from the 28th to the 30th of November this year, we will host an international conference to mark 10 years since the launch of the UK's Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative. And we will continue, more broadly, to respond robustly to reports of conflict-related sexual violence wherever and whenever they occur. We call on others to do so too. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on the distinguished colleague of Nigeria. The floor is yours.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the special representatives of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict and for Children and Armed Conflict, and the permanent mission of the Argentina for organizing today's important event to commemorate the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. Sexual violence in conflict continues to inflict pain and trauma on its victims around the world. It has devastating impact on individuals, families, and communities. Unfortunately, women and girls are disproportionately impacted by armed conflict and are usually seen by perpetrators as spoils of war. They are subjected to all manners of torture, and their fundamental rights and dignity have been violated and exploited. Despite efforts geared towards the eradication of all forms of conflict-related sexual violence, the world still witnesses a surge in sexual violence in conflict. This, no doubt, calls for more responsiveness and action in ensuring that we eliminate all forms of sexual violence in conflict that threaten our global peace and security by collectively doing more to prevent sexual violence and bringing perpetrators to justice. However, the question remains, how do we ensure that we protect the next generation from this same plight of sexual violence even in conflict? Your Excellencies, my distinguished colleagues, we must do more collectively to address the root causes of conflict, such as poverty, human rights abuses, hate speech, victimization, climate change, gender-based discrimination, stereotyping women for being the cause of rape, male superiority, and the exclusion of the girl child. We must also take proactive steps to protect our citizens by reforming and strengthening our institutions, such as the schools, the judiciary, the police, and the media. In conclusion, Nigeria remains committed to ensuring the security of women and girls during conflict and enhancing their active and direct participation in conflict prevention and peace building. We have also taken measures to enhance the security of women and girls in internally displaced persons camps, in schools, reduce their vulnerability, and promote their safe return to their homes. We owe it to the next generations to prevent them from being victims of sexual violence and conflict in the first place. I thank you all.
Thank you, dear colleague, for your statement. I'm pleased to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway.
Thank you. I want to thank the Office of the SRSG on Sexual Violence in Conflict, the Office of the SRSG for Silent Children and Armed Conflict, and the Permanent Mission of Argentina for convening today's event. I also want to thank Ms. Kofi for always being strong voice on women's participation and rights. Many country situations has been mentioned today, including Yemen, Ethiopia, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, to mention a few. Reflecting on the extent to which Security Council resolutions and the accountability mechanisms linked to them are effective poses important questions which deserves consistent and thorough attention across different forums. In this regard, we welcome the new framework on CRSV. I'll make 3 points from the view of an elected member to the Security Council. Operationalization. First, we must support capacity building of law enforcement, security, and military sector personnel in UN peacekeeping operation and in international institutions. It is the only way to ensure that our words are translated into action. It also helps to address underlying harmful norms and attitudes and reinforce accountability structures. This is why Norway contributes to the UN Specialized Police Team, which supports South Sudanese police in investigating sexual and gender-based violence, and the development of DPO's handbook for UN field missions on preventing and responding to conflict-related sexual violence. Second, financing and resources. Both are prerequisites for monitoring and implementation. It is as simple as that. As co-chair of the States and Donors Working Group, we work closely with partners to increase political will, mobilize financial resources, and strengthen operational capacity on support for better services and compliance with relevant international law obligations related to CRSV and SGBV. I also want to underscore the need for concerted efforts in the Fifth Committee to ensure sufficient resources to prevent and respond to CRSV. We need more deployed women protection advisors and child protection advisors. They are crucial in fulfilling what we, the member states, ask to be done through our resolutions. Third and finally, agency and partnerships. A survivor-centered approach should be a given. Those affected by sexual violence do not lose their agency. Thus, they have the right to help define their own needs and priorities. The Secretary General's report highlights the importance of political and diplomatic engagement in the context of peace and cessation of hostilities negotiations. In our experience, this engagement is most effective through enabling women peace builders, human rights defenders, and civil society to mobilize their own. Ownership of the agenda, both from the parties and affected population, is another prerequisite for impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear colleague. I'm pleased to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the Mission of Argentina, and thank you to the Office of SRSG Pate and SRSG Gamba for this very important meeting today. Thank you to all the briefers for their very insightful and comprehensive presentations. Indeed, conflict-related sexual violence is a core security challenge. At the very heart of this issue is the fundamental principle of women's full enjoyment of human rights. Despite the robust normative framework we have been able to develop through years in condemning all forms of conflict-related sexual violence, it continues to persist in many parts of the world. Sexual violence continues to be used as a weapon of war and terror to punish civilians and terrorize communities. This is what has or is happening in many war theaters, from Tigray to Syria, from Myanmar, Afghanistan to Yemen, but not only, the list is much longer. As the days go by, we see new gruesome pictures getting out of the darkness of the war in Ukraine, and we hear new chilling testimonies of women, girls, and children raped and abused by Russian soldiers. Mr. Chair, conflict-related sexual violence has a dehumanizing nature. It doesn't just harm a single individual or single family or even a single group. It negatively affects and endangers families and communities, erodes social and political stability, and undermines economic progress and reconciliations. Mr. Chair, if we want to properly address this horrible crime and empower the victims of conflict-related sexual violence, we need to do more in three main areas. First, we must prioritize prevention. Prevention is the best protection. Addressing the underlying root causes and invisible drivers of sexual violence is crucial for the prevention of and response to conflict-related sexual violence. At the Security Council, we have to do more to integrate prevention of conflict-related sexual violence in the mandates of peace operations. Second, improve and strengthen accountability. Ensuring accountability and putting an end to impunity for violations and abuses must be a priority. To this end, we must make sure all cases of conflict-related sexual violence are documented. Only by evidence can we have accountability. Third, ensure the effective and secure participation of civil society, in particular women's organizations, in all efforts to address conflict-related sexual violence at all stages, including reparation and rehabilitation. Civil society organizations play a crucial role in documenting the conflict-related sexual violence cases and in ensuring adequate and survivor-centered responses to those crimes. Mr. Chair, it is time for all of us to assume our responsibility and go beyond condemning this behavior and take concrete steps to prevent violence, protect individuals, punish perpetrators, and provide redress to victims. Albania stands ready to do its part and cooperate with all those willing to invest in the future and make our world a better and safer place for all. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Enyan. I'm pleased to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
Thank you. Excellencies, I begin by thanking the Permanent Mission of Argentina, the Office of the SRSG on Sexual Violence and Conflict, and the Office of the SRSG on Children and Armed Conflict for organizing this important event. I also warmly thank all the special guests for their insightful remarks. Malta also aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union earlier. As has been pointed out during today's event, conflict-related sexual violence is indeed preventable. Current strategies that address sexualized violence in war have mostly focused on perpetrator accountability and survivor support after violence has occurred. Although both are essential, let us remember CRSV is preventable, and we can mitigate these harms. Malta acknowledges the work the United Nations has done to prevent and address CRSV in conflict and post-conflict settings across the globe, the bulk of which have taken place in zones of instability and conflict, including, as we have heard today, Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, Libya, Mali, Myanmar, Somalia, South Sudan, Yemen, and most recently in Ukraine. Sexual violence in conflict affects all people due to a variety of intersectional reasons. Men and boys are among the highest number of those affected by sexual violence in detention settings. Malta therefore calls for renewed attention to the protection of women, men, girls, boys, and all people of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity. We welcome the launching of a new framework for the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence, which we think will bring different stakeholders together in the fight against CRSV. On the occasion of this important International Day, I reiterate that Malta stands in solidarity with the survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and those working to support them. Engaging in CRSV is a choice. We should not underestimate the need for continued dialogue and education within this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear colleague. And our final speaker, I'm pleased to give the floor to distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Excellency. Thank you very much. Costa Rica would like to appreciate the convening of this meeting by the Permanent Mission of Argentina, as well as the co-host, the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Patton, and SRSG, Gamba. We, of course, in this International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, we would like to reiterate that we states are called upon to prevent, investigate, and punish and eradicate sexual violence in conflict. As my country has stated in different fora, we are of the view that the most important task for states is to end impunity. And we call all states to rally behind this task, this priority. To do that, in order to do that, we need to enhance and to ensure accountability. All state and non-state actors implicated in atrocities must be held accountable. This work begins, of course, with the adoption of actions at the national level, including legislation, strengthening judicial institutions, and guaranteeing victims and survivors access to justice and full reparations. Rule of law also in this regard is crucial. At the international level, the International Criminal Court plays a fundamental role in this regard, and Costa Rica urges to continue promoting the progressiveness of the Rome Statute. Secondly, my country firmly believes that it is crucial to modify the reductionist and binary vision with which sexual violence in our conflict has been addressed. And the presenters today have raised key insights on how boys, men, but also LGBTIQ persons are also victims of sexual violence. Indeed, these people have been for too long relegated from this topic. So we call upon all the international community and member states as well to broaden the conversation in order to address the needs of all victims. So a victim-centered approach and a gender perspective mainstreaming is key for more inclusive and effective accountability. I would like to add to this the importance of intersectionality in order to understand as well the complexity of the situations of each victim in different parts of the world. And third, Costa Rica believes that the international response to conflict has to, indeed, as you have said and as the presenters have said, has to focus on prevention. Prevention that requires enabling a safe environment for victims and survivors who denounce, who claim their demands, for human rights defenders who work underground to protect the rights of victims and survivors. And of course, it was mentioned indeed as well, the protection of journalists and whistleblowers and people in the ground who claim and demand justice for the victims. Again, we appreciate the convening of this meeting. The presentations and the participation of these different actors just reflects upon the complexity, but also the need for the international community and for the UN to work together through different expertise and roles to definitely end sexual violence. Thank you very much, Excellency.
Thank you, dear colleague. The purpose of this annual commemoration is to stand in solidarity with survivors and those working to support them. And as such, it is appropriate to give the final word this morning to the Executive Director of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security, Ms. Kavya Soka. Kavya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to address you today on behalf of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. While the conflict in Ukraine is at the forefront of media coverage and Security Council discussions right now, the use of sexual violence, as you've heard today, is a hallmark of every conflict that is currently raging and used against people of all genders, whether we are discussing Ethiopia, Myanmar, Afghanistan, or so many others. In short, we know the challenges, but we also know what to do. Prevention requires using all the tools at your disposal, especially your political capital as member states, your resources, and upstream preventative diplomacy. And I'd like to share a few key messages from civil society on how to do so. For women in conflict zones, conflict-related sexual violence is deeply related to broader repression of their rights. These are inseparable, and so they must be addressed as such. My main message to you is that supporting all women's rights and their full, equal, and meaningful participation in all decision-making is the most effective way to end conflict-related sexual violence. And I urge you to apply this approach consistently in all contexts through all your policies and decisions. We have all watched in horror the developments in Afghanistan since last August. You have heard directly from Afghan women, including today, how they are being systematically eliminated from public life. They cannot speak, dress, move, work, or do as they please. While UNAMA now has a robust mandate to prioritize gender equality through all its work, including addressing gender-based violence and implementing a survivor-centered approach, for real change, for UNAMA to be effective, you, member states, must be united and unequivocal that you will not tolerate any more violations of women's rights and that there will be repercussions for such violations. 2, I urge you to offer your full support to all women human rights defenders in conflict situations who play such critical roles in promoting peace, human rights, and accountability, and are, as a result, at risk of being targeted for violence. Your support for human rights defenders is essential not only to end conflicts and build peace, but a critical part of prevention. Threats and violence against activists must be treated as an early warning sign of escalating conflict and instability. In this regard, we fully support SRSG Patton's recommendation in her latest report to protect politically active women, including women human rights defenders, journalists, and peace builders, including those working directly on conflict-related sexual violence, from any form of reprisals. This means women in Myanmar, in Afghanistan, in Sudan, in Yemen, Palestine, and so many other contexts where they are actively attacked for who they are and what they do. Women and LGBTQI activists have been at the forefront of Myanmar's Spring Revolution, and the military has deliberately targeted them, both through the threats and brutal use of sexual assault, employed as a form of collective punishment to retaliate against anyone who resists. 3. Women's rights organizations play a critical role in gender-based violence prevention and response, including in humanitarian settings, where they are often filling gaps in state-provided services. In crisis situations, it's critical that these organizations receive direct, flexible, and core funding to sustain their ability to provide the full suite of services. They are best placed to reach the most marginalized and at-risk groups in times of crisis. This applies to Myanmar, where local and ethnic women's organizations have been providing humanitarian aid to those in need and who have access to areas that the UN does not. It applies to Ukraine, where women's organizations are providing frontline support not only in Ukraine, but to refugees in transit and host countries, as well as legal advice and health care to women, girls, and marginalized populations. These organizations need your support and resources to scale up to meet these escalating challenges. 4. A note on survivor-centered approaches. While it's very positive to see so many member states today supporting a survivor-centered approach in their statements, this really must translate into action on the ground. In Ethiopia, where the scale and brutality of the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war by all parties has been well documented, survivors in the Tigray region struggle to access post-rape care and reproductive health services due to the chokehold that the siege has placed on the operations of medical facilities and care providers. Limited supplies and closing operational spaces have forced many providers to downsize when they should have been scaling up. No part of a survivor-centered approach can be effectively achieved under a siege. We urge you to call on the Ethiopian authorities to end their restrictions on delivery of humanitarian assistance and operations of medical personnel, and to adopt a framework of cooperation to address conflict-related sexual violence as soon as possible, and for the Secretary General to add actors responsible for the use of sexual violence to the list of parties in his next annual report. Finally, a survivor-centered approach includes protection of sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is not only a life-saving component of this approach, but an international legal obligation, not a voluntary commitment. The crisis in Ukraine is severely jeopardizing the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls. Military strikes against maternity hospitals and other healthcare facilities have killed and gravely harmed women and children in Ukraine, including pregnant women and newborn babies. The health system is collapsing, and access to sexual and reproductive health care is drastically reduced. We urge the EU, donor governments, and the international community to ensure that all humanitarian response plans, financing, and assistance respect human rights and prioritize sexual and reproductive rights of girls, women, and marginalized populations in Ukraine, as well as transit and host countries. Our messages today don't just apply to the examples I've shared of Myanmar, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, or Ukraine, but to all conflict situations, because there is no context where women's rights are not relevant. At pivotal moments in the conflicts that we see around us today, women human rights defenders have warned the international community of what may happen without decisive action and what the costs would be. Committing to the WPS agenda and to preventing conflict-related sexual violence means listening to what women on the ground are telling you and acting on it. Not just today, the International Day for the Elimination of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, but every day as you determine the fate of women and girls in conflict zones around the world. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Kavya, for the advocacy and work of the NGO working group. I wish to close this year's commemoration with SRSG Patton's admonition that sexual violence and conflict is not inevitable, it is preventable, and to thank everybody here today for your commitment to the cause. Thank you.